Now, joining us at the moment is the legendary Brendan McGuire. Of course, he's the voice of the Regina Rams. He's a writer on Three Down Nation. He hosts In the Huddle on Access. He's multi-talented, and I don't know how good he is at doing his dishes, but he's multi-talented in all things sports. And you know, Brendan, I've never really liked Gary Bettman, and I don't know if you probably didn't hear earlier when we had Brad Watson, former NHL referee, on the show. But I asked him the question. Actually, Dave was going to ask him the question, but I got in ahead of him. I asked him the question, have you ever been told to change the style of your officiating, be it from regular season to playoffs or one playoff round to the next? Have you ever been told by, your leaders in the NHL to change the style? I always thought I'm going to put him on the spot with that question. And don't forget, he's got his pension as well. He still works in the NHL as an official with his supervisors, but he had his pension on the line on this question, so I didn't know if he'd answered, but he did answer it. And I was shocked with his answer, Brendan, because he said, no, Gary Bettman gives us a speech, gives the officials a speech at the beginning of the year and the beginning of the playoff run. Do not change your style of refereeing under any circumstance. All these years, I've thought Gary Bettman's sort of a bad guy, and now I hear that he's actually not. Are you surprised that as far as the officials are concerned, they have never been told to change their style in the playoffs?
Not really. I don't know that I've ever thought Gary Bettman was a bad guy. I think he's in a position that makes him a bad guy because there was once upon a time when, there was an era when the commissioner of any league would brag about making the game holier than thou and pushing back on interference from certain owners, etc. And that's all changed. They say after Bowie Kuhn left as commissioner of Major League Baseball, that changed because from then on, it was always just a yes man who they would put in the position. I think Gary Bettman actually handles all of that fairly well. I met him once when he appeared in Estevan, Saskatchewan. I got an opportunity to do a one-on-one with him. And it lasted all of, I think, 3 minutes. And he was just so cold, like just no personality whatsoever. And I get the sense that he's just very focused on what he's doing. And I've never had, look, there are some commissioners who you can look at and say, he's a little bit greasy. I never got that vibe from Gary Bettman. I feel like he's a slippery lawyer, right? Like, and I don't think he understands the sport very well. And so the reason that's a detriment to him is because when it's time to make changes, when they need to make changes, he always defers to hockey people and he lets them fight it out. And the problem is, I actually think that's the worst thing you can do sometimes, because you shouldn't be making changes just for what the hockey people want. It's for what the viewer wants and what the fans want. So, as far as I don't love Gary Bettman either. I don't love any commissioner. But as far as like being a bad guy, I think he's probably better than most.
Well, my bone to pick with Gary Bettman is he has categorically denied that CTE has anything to do with playing hockey. And been
very aggressive toward reporters who, and sorry, I was just going to say, he's been very pushy to reporters who try to dig on that too. Like he's out and out ridiculed reporters for making the suggestion.
Yeah, he gets prickly. And how do you feel if you're a family member of a player that's killed himself because of CTE, and you've got the commissioner of your league denying that there's any sort of a connection with the sport of hockey, especially in the NHL where it's faster, bigger, stronger. So that's my problem with Gary Bettman, and he doesn't want the owners to pay up like the NFL has. And, to me, it's all about money with Gary Bettman. It's not necessarily what's better for hockey. He's a businessman. He's loading up the owner's pockets, and he does a darn good job at it. And if you're an NHL owner that wants to get richer, he's your man because he's grown the game amazingly. Although TV ratings in the U.S. were down this year, a lot of people may not know that, but they're doing very well in Canada. The game is still growing. Now we go to the absurdity. We're going to talk football. I don't know, we got onto this because of what Brad Watson said earlier, but now we go to the absurdity of possibly going to 34 NHL teams from 32. Houston and Atlanta look to be on deck. It'll be harder again for Canada to win a Stanley Cup. But you've only got 32 in the NFL. You got 30 in the NBA. You've got 30 in Major League Baseball. I don't know how many there is in Major League Soccer. But my argument, this is just owner greed, because when I take a look at the fourth lines and the third lines on NHL teams, with the exception of maybe Florida, the way they were playing, there's a lot of players in the NHL at the bottom of the lineups, not at the top. They've still got some good players there, but at the bottom of the lineup that to me aren't really of what I would consider NHL quality players, because there's not enough players in the world to have a lineup that's really deep with high caliber players with 32 teams. Now they're going to 34. And I just think it's just a money grab, and the hockey's not going to be as good again. What do you think of that?
Well, the supply of athletes isn't there for the sport of hockey that they are for the other sports. So what are we doing, jumping, and by we I mean the NHL, jumping way out in front of the NFL, the Major League Baseball, the NBA? It's interesting that the NBA, since the Toronto Raptors and Vancouver Grizzlies entered in the mid-'90s, I think have only expanded by one team. Charlotte got a team in the early 2000s, but essentially it's been probably 30-some years. The NBA has gone from 27 to 30. The NHL in that same time frame has gone from 21 to 32, and pretty soon 34. And that to me is the sign of a business, as far as Major League Sports go, that's in trouble, because you're watering down your supply, but you're also cutting that pie more different ways, kind of like what you said. Now all of a sudden you get a big TV contract in Canada or the United States, and the TV deal with the NHL is still significant to the NHL, even to the American teams. Yeah. And so if you splinter it two more ways, to me that's not showing a lot of long-term vision. I don't know that going to those, I do think Houston's a good market. I've long questioned why they aren't in Houston, and I do think there are other American cities that would do okay, but I've never understood this fascination with Atlanta. I mean, if Ted Turner couldn't make it work in Atlanta, what makes anybody think that anybody else could either? And why would you want to be in Atlanta? And a lot of NHL teams, quite frankly, it sounds like a lot of Major League sports teams, it's a major misconception that they are all super profitable, right? Because we hear about the gaudy sales numbers whenever they sell the franchise. CNBC did a really good piece on this a few months ago, where they talked about there actually have been a few franchises in the NBA, the Boston Celtics for a long time, that have been like publicly owned. And they didn't do well because nobody was putting more money into it. These franchises usually do well because rich people who own them pay the cost to buy the franchise, and then they pump a bunch of money into it. They lose money for the 10, 20 years, whatever it is, and then they're able to sell it for a fortune at the end of the day, and that's why it all works out. So you've got money-losing franchises everywhere, and you're just going to splinter it more. It almost becomes a pyramid scheme at some point. And they're able to convince people to pay these crazy expansion fees, and it's just very short-sighted, because that's going to run out at some point. You can't keep expanding like this forever, whereas other leagues like the NBA, like the NFL, understand that the longer they wait, the more profitable that will be in the long run when they go to expand. They understand the need to do it slowly and carefully. We're not seeing that with the NHL.
Well, those are really good points. And you go over to the CFL, and I hope it never changes that Saskatchewan and Winnipeg are publicly owned, particularly here, because, the way it's set up here, the fans believe they have a stake in this, as owners per se, and it also gives them a voice that they feel should be heard at times because of the public ownership. And we were talking earlier with Dave off camera with Dave Thomas and how ridiculous it is when people call the Rough Riders Regina. Dave was telling me he was talking to Craig Reynolds, I think at the AGM, and Craig Reynolds told him, the president and CEO of the Rough Riders, that 60% of their ticket sales are outside of Regina. And we all know through the decades, this team wouldn't even exist if it was just a Regina team. There's no question about that. So, I don't know. I just got that off the top of my head when we're talking about ownership of pro sports franchises. I think, particularly Saskatchewan, it has to always stay publicly owned. I mean, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think there are a few franchises that it just has to be that way. The Green Bay Packers would be the same way, I think, in the NFL.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Because people feel like they have some ownership. And the other thing that we shouldn't lose sight of is the fact that really for the longest time, if you look back over the last 40 years, the three most successfully run franchises economically have been Winnipeg, Saskatchewan, and Edmonton, who up until recently were publicly owned as well. So, did the Elks have to privatize? It sounds like they did. They had serious concerns that they were going to run out of money if they didn't.
Yeah.
But by and large, if you can keep it as a publicly traded entity, I think there's a lot of proof to show that has been the model of profit in the Canadian Football League. Now, I can appreciate how that is at odds with some owners around the league, particularly in Toronto. And this is nothing new. It's been this way forever, where when you sit at the Board of Governors table, the private owners want one thing and the publicly run clubs quite often want something different. And the owners of, say, the Argos or whoever it is at that time are complaining, saying, well, they're not putting their own money on the line. I am. So that sometimes does cause friction. But
that happened with Randy Ambrosie leaving, as far as I understand, as the commissioner of the CFL. As far as I understand, Saskatchewan supported him. But some of the recent owners that have bought CFL franchises did not, because they didn't feel the value of their franchise was increasing enough, or at all even.
I think it runs better publicly, especially if it's been public for so long. But I've never fully understood it. But when the Edmonton Oilers were rescued, when Peter Pocklington in, I'm going to say 1998, sold them to Les Alexander at the time. He was the owner of the Houston Rockets, and they were going to move to Houston. And there was this condition that they had 60 days to match it. And there was a consortium that would have included like thousands of people, but there was concern that would really hurt the value of the franchise. So instead, they decided to go and find, I think it was like 38 different people who would each kick in $1 to $5 million. So that has an impact, I guess, on franchise value. But in a market like Saskatchewan, I think it's such an outlier and it's so unique. I have a hard time believing that if the Rough Riders were ever privately owned, that you'd get the same buy-in from around the province, which you need. Otherwise, we don't have a franchise.
Yeah, I mean, in theory, being a football fan here in Saskatchewan, we should all be Green Bay Packer fans because they're so similar to Saskatchewan in certain ways. However, I became a Minnesota Viking fan because, after the Grey Cup, long before you were born, Brendan, after the Grey Cup, the CBC gave us Minnesota Vikings games in Saskatchewan. Joe Kapp was the quarterback of the BC Lions of the Vikings, and Bud Grant was the coach. Of course, won all the Grey Cups in the late 50s and whatnot, early 60s with the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, so I was attracted to that team right away. Plus, I like the fact that the old Metropolitan Stadium in the playoffs, they really froze their butts off, and now, of course, it's the sterile U.S. Bank Stadium. But that's how I became a Vikings fan. But in reality, we should all be Packers fans because they really resemble the Rough Riders in so many different ways. So George Cortez is considered to be an offensive genius, or was considered to be an offensive genius when he was in the CFL. He started coaching in the CFL with the old Montreal Concorde back in 1980 for the defunct Montreal Concorde. Bad name, bad logo, bad uniform, but it doesn't matter anymore. He coached in Saskatchewan twice, 2006 as well as 2013 and 14. 5-time Grey Cup champion. He coached in the NFL with the Buffalo Bills. And George Cortez, he's actually a professor. He reminds you of a professor, not me. I'm not a professor, but George Cortez actually is. You had a really interesting conversation, Brendan, with George Cortez. Why scoring isn't higher in the CFL? What did George Cortez say?
Well, as you know, I love to romance about the early 90s all the time and what was great about it and what's different now and what's not actually different, but the perception is there that maybe it's different. And so I called him up. He says, call me back tomorrow at this time, but I'm going to give you a little homework assignment. Look up this, this, and this about why it's different. And the big thing that he focused on, I think there was one point in the early 90s when the average amount of offensive plays that a CFL team would run in one game would be just under 70. And today, I believe it's right around, last season, I believe it was right around 55. So you have a lot fewer plays. And so he blames a lot. Now, this is why. And these are things that I think people in the league fully understand. But those of us who don't do it every day and are not primetime experts don't think of. Like George, it's his life. He thinks about this stuff all the time, even today, he tells me. But number one, there's a lot fewer plays because one reason is, and I didn't know this, outside of the three-point convert, they run the clock during the convert attempt when you're lining up for the convert and everything else. And that wastes a bunch of time. They never used to do that. The reason they do that is because they want the game to fall within the 3-hour block, which makes sense. They don't want too many games getting too far out. I think the biggest one that there were two more really good ones. One is they have a 40-second clock in the National Football League. So when the player is tackled, let's say it's a bomb, like 50 yards down to the 10, the moment that receiver is tackled, that 40-second clock is ticking. So they really need to hustle down there to get the next play off. It used to be that way in Canada. The rules are different because we've got a 20-second clock, but it's an apples to grapes comparison because that 20-second clock doesn't start running until the ref gets the ball lined up and blows it in, right? There used to be a rush to do that, but that has changed. He says there's lots of plays where they just totally dawdle in getting down there, geting set. They're waiting for players to get set. Yeah, exactly. It's very player friendly. I'm sure the players just love it, but it has an impact. And the last part that I really give George a lot of credit for, because another offensive guy, Mike Kelly, he was in Winnipeg for a long time. He thinks that the offensive coordinators today just aren't that good. And George said, no, it's not that. It's really hard to play offense in today's CFL. The biggest reason is because the roster sizes are bigger than they used to be. And so there's just so much rotating happening on the defense. And so you've always got these fresh defenders who are coming in and they're subbing in. And that just makes it so much harder. And his suggested solution was maybe go back to a smaller roster size again so you don't have that. I can't see any of that happening, although the players might be open to something like that because they'd all get paid more in theory if you have fewer players on the roster, but then you're going to have more injuries and yada, yada, yada. So that was really interesting to hear that from George because he's basically saying, hey, you might think that I'm a genius and that the players we had in the 90s were superior to what they have today, but that's not really true. They face a lot more barriers today than we did back then.
As usual, our chit-chat goes by so fast and it ends too quickly. But
never long enough.
We thank you for being smart enough to talk to George Cortez about this because that's all he thinks about. So you've run into the right guy to study this. Thanks a lot for joining us on Sports Cage, Brendan. Sports Cage continues in just a moment.